Thank you everyone for coming. I'm just going to give a short intro and then we'll hand it off to the speakers. So in 1999, a young woman named Heyman Lee was strangled to death in Baltimore, Maryland, not long after her ex-boyfriend Adnan Syed was convicted of her murder. For 15 years, Syed has maintained his innocence through 2 trials and multiple appeals with the help of family friend and lawyer Rabia Chaudry. Last year, when it seemed like relief through the courts might never come, Chaudry took a gamble and reached out to Sarah Koenig, a producer for This American Life. Koenig heard the story and was hooked, and now millions of other people are too, through the hit podcast Serial. Serial, a fresh look at Syed's case, debuted at the top of the charts on iTunes and has been the subject of nearly inescapable discussion online and offline. Here to speak with us today is Rabia Chaudry, an attorney, fellow at New America Foundation, and advocate for Adnan Syed. Joining her in discussion of criminal justice and the power of storytelling is Bruce Shapiro, the executive director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia Journalism School and a contributing editor at The Nation. The Yale Muslim Students Association would like to thank our co-sponsors, Orville H. Schell Jr. Center for International Human Rights at Yale Law School, the South Asian Society, and the Afro-American Culture Center. Without their support, this event wouldn't have been possible. Please join us in welcoming our speakers.
Okay, I guess I'll just get started. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks so much for inviting me. Special thanks to the Yale MSA, the Muslim Student Association, and all the co-sponsors. I think maybe this is my 18th or 20th talk about the case in different parts of the country, just literally in the last few months. And I seem to be especially doing rounds of from Stanford to Princeton to UPenn Law of the schools I never would have gotten into had I applied. And I'm also getting to talk to the people who will be our future overlords, so that's great. Probably employ me very soon at some point. So I'm going to get to Serial, and I'm going to get to Adnan's case. And I know a lot of questions from you guys are going to be focused on that, but I thought I'd give a little bit of context, especially because, and I'm just assuming that most of you are not part of the Muslim Student Association here. I could be wrong. But it's just a wild guess. But I do want to give a little bit of context about the American Muslim community, and it's, for the last couple of decades, what I have witnessed as its struggle to tell its stories, and then we'll get to Serial. So about 20 years ago, when I was about graduating from college and moving towards law school, that's when I first started cutting my teeth on advocacy, and I started becoming an activist. Like it was the right time. You're in college, that's the time the bug hits you, and like a lot of young Muslim Americans, I started off doing pro-Palestinian activism. Now, this is a time way before 9/11, not way, but well before 9/11. And a lot of people have this idea that before 9/11 we were doing really, really well, and our narratives were great, and Muslims were not experiencing a lot of anti-Muslim bigotry, which compared to today, we really were doing great. But if you actually think about it, it was still post the Gulf War, right? We had a World Trade Center attack, we had the Iran hostage crisis. The only popular point of reference I can remember ever in 1991 was released in the form of a movie and in terms of the relationship between a Muslim man and a woman. And it was a movie called Not Without My Daughter. Does anybody remember that? A lot of you were really, really, I don't know, were you even born? I'm not sure. You might not have been born then. But I remember that movie, and I remember just like my family and people I knew were just kind of horrified because this was the popular depiction now. And in that movie, there was an American woman, Sally Fields, who married, and she forever ruined the flying nun for me by doing the movie. I loved her. But she marries an Iranian man, and then they go to Iran, and basically he kidnaps the kids. And so the whole story is about she's not going to return to the United States without my daughter. It's been 24 years, and even today, when I speak to non-Muslim audiences, like if I speak at a synagogue or a church, I swear people ask me about that movie still. Like it's like buried in the consciousness of Americans that this is what a relationship is like between a man and a woman, and this is way before 9/11. So anyhow, I started off as a pro-Palestinian activist. I did some remarkably stupid things like protesting for the Holocaust Museum once, which is abhorrent, ridiculous, but I got smarter and older, and you do some things like streaking and burning stuff and doing things you shouldn't as a 21-year-old that later you learn. But then 9/11 happened. 9/11 happened, and that's when I started seeing the community really, really come together in terms of we need to organize a response. We need our organizations to be better. We have no organizations, we have no lobby, we have no voice, and we were very much on the defensive. Now, up until 2001, 9/11, I always remembered hearing, we have these annual conferences, which is 30,000 Muslims get together for 4 days, and they eat a lot, and they have all these speeches, Islam, Islamic Society in North America. My parents took me every year because they wanted to help build a Muslim identity. And we always heard the same thing. Whenever they had the little rooms set on the side for the smaller, how to politically organize, it was always well, look at the Jewish American community. Look what they've been able to do with small numbers. They organize so well. They have so much impact and influence on policy. And how come we can't do that? We can do that. And I've been hearing that since middle school. And you know what? We still can't do that. It's 2015. We still can't do that. But anyhow, so after 9/11, we saw more organization. And it was good. It was good to see that, it took a long time for us to catch up. There were a lot of spaces that had voids. So in the immediate years after 9/11, and this is a space that I work in, and that's why I can speak to it, a lot of law enforcement agencies and the military, they suddenly said, oh, we need training on Islam and Muslims. We don't know what we're dealing with. And so all these trainers came in who basically were really, really bigoted and gave really terrible, terrifying trainings, and they just jumped the gun on us. We didn't have the resources, and we didn't even know what was going on. It took many years later that reports were done, and the Pentagon's like, oops, and the FBI's like, uh-oh, let's stop this. But it was maybe almost a decade of these types of trainings. So we just couldn't get it together. Now, in 2015, the sad truth is that we kind of still don't have it together. We have a couple of lobbying organizations. We have a civil rights group that's been active for a while now. But right now, levels of anti-Muslim sentiment are higher today than they were right after 9/11, which should be shocking for people, right? You would think that would be the time at which Americans distrusted Muslims the most, distrusted Islam the most, but that's not true. In 2015, those sentiments are much stronger today than they were then. So what happened in all these years, and how long has it been? Since 9/11, a long time, that we have failed. And when I look at our activism and advocacy, what I realize is that we've done a lot of it's been defensive. A lot of it's been trying to offer facts. Let me show you how many Muslims there are. Let me show you how many terrorists there are. Let me show you that Muslim women are really educated. Let me tell you how long Islam has been in America. We've been here since, significant numbers since the slaves were brought over. We've been doing all of this, but we've failed miserably still in communicating who we are and who's winning online. And this is actually my work with the New America Foundation. I run a project there that's funded by Google and Facebook, all about basically populating online spaces with authentic American Muslim narratives. Because we're losing. We're losing to extremists, violent extremists, and who, by the way, echo anti-Muslim bigots. So, for example, there's an entire industry of people who is dedicated to making sure that they spread memes about Muslims. And I'll give you a couple examples because they'll be very familiar to you. But for example, one of the memes might be that Muslims cannot live with non-Muslims. They have the Muslims consider non-Muslims infidels, and infidels have to either convert or be killed. This is a very popular meme that's been spread. And here's the thing: so when the anti-Muslim bigots start spreading that kind of propaganda, people like ISIS and Al-Qaeda say, well, actually, yes, that's true. That's true. So they echo one another, and in the middle, 1.6 billion people are like, oh, wait a minute, that's not true. But nobody hears us. So my work online is, my work with New America Foundation is a lot about how do we effectively overpower these ideas. Some of them, and one thing I realized is that we really, we've tried for decades to make the mainstream media pay attention to us and tell our positive stories, and they're not going to do it. They don't do it. But what has happened is the memes that have stuck, and I'm going to just throw out a few to see if you guys recognize them. Okay. Muhammad is a pedophile. How many people have heard that? Just raise your hand if you heard it. You've heard it, okay. Islam is not really a religion, it's a cult. Anybody heard that? A few people heard that. Islam is a religion of violence. Okay. Yeah, oh good, that's a lot of people. We're all on the same page. I mean, there's a whole list of them. And this is very organized. There's actually a blog called The Gates of Vienna, and the blogger in The Gates of Vienna was very closely allied to this cottage industry. Once wrote a blog called Overselling the Meme. And in it, he actually writes about the meme that Muhammad is a pedophile. And he literally says, and it's on his blog, he says, we know historically this is actually not true, but we just want to plant the seed of that idea. So when I'm, again, doing these talks in different interfaith spaces, people say, well, isn't that true? Because it's stuck. And the only response Muslims have had is, well, Islam is a religion of peace. And it's not working. Nobody's buying it. Nobody's buying that. And we have failed miserably at having counter memes, or having any memes that stick. Nobody's buying anything we're selling. So, fast forward to cereal. Cereal happened not because I was like, this is a strategic way that it was an act of desperation for me to contact Sarah Koenig. And I learned such a tremendous amount from this experience, because for me, while I was teaching social media advocacy skills, or helping facilitate those trainings at least, because we have like professional folks who work with us, what I realized was that the power, first of all, that social media tools have, especially for marginalized communities and communities who aren't able to get their voices in the mainstream media. So as Sarah's, serial started like airing every week, I had thought, well, originally I'm going to write like this one really long form essay, I'll submit it to the Atlantic, or somebody who, to talk about the case and its impact on the community. And I realized there was just no time for that. Like, people wanted an immediate response. So I said, okay, I have a blog. I'll start blogging. Like, every week I'll just start blogging my response to Sarah. I have documents, I've got some pictures of Adnan. I'll throw things up there because my objective is to keep the case of interest and alive, and also tell more of the story than Sarah was telling, because obviously, she's a storyteller. She is an amazing, amazing storyteller, and she did the most remarkable job. And what I was fascinated about, and I was worried when I went to Sarah, because I said, or to media in general, because I said, number one, because of the way I look, people look at me and immediately, without me opening my mouth, they're going to have certain assumptions about me. A lot of Adnan's community looks like me, his parents look like me. Today, Adnan looks like the kind of person that the average American might cross the street if they saw coming, because he has a beard. Imagine when you think of Muslim inmates, prison Islam, right? That's what he looks like, because that's what he grew up in since 17. He's got the beard, he's got the skull cap, he's got his pants rolled up. He's the sweetest guy ever, but it's something that if somebody were to see it, so I thought about that. I'm like, if I go to media, he was already judged as a Muslim in 2000, 1999, right? I mean, like, that was the way the case was framed. This is a Muslim guy who was honored killing, killed his ex-girlfriend. Like, what's going to happen now when people hate Muslims so much? So it was a fear. And what was remarkable is that fear never came, it never happened. It never came to pass. Because Sarah was able to tell a story about people and human beings that had nothing to do with what we are almost always tied to, terrorism, right, acts of violence. She humanized Muslims in a way by basically kind of ignoring that whole thing, ignoring the Muslim-y part of us. And I was struck because I realized what we had been doing. Muslim advocacy had always been leading with, hi, I'm a Muslim, let me tell you about Islam. Hi, I'm a Muslim, I give charity because I'm a good Muslim. And people are like, we don't care. We just don't care. Or we don't want to hear why you're good. Like, people aren't interested. And I realized that we're just failing at telling stories. So for me, the greatest lesson has been to tell stories as people, because as many human interest stories as there are in non-Muslim populations, of course, just as many exist in Muslim populations, even not more, because Muslims are one of the most diverse groups in America. You have refugees, you have people who are like 10th generation Muslims, you have people, I mean, like, it's, pick it, you'll find it. You will find that American Muslim experience. So the power of storytelling was really important to me, and then I also learned that we don't have to run after mainstream media anymore, because I was blogging and tweeting. I was like tweeting in my sleep, Like, I was tweeting. And I realized that's all and I was one person. I did not, people ask me, like, who was your team of volunteers? I'm like, I was it. It was me and my thumb. And I have a sore thumb for 3 months now. But I think it would have looked different if I had not been blogging and tweeting. We would have listened to Serial, and it would have been done. But I was like, there was nothing I could have done. Well, there's nothing I was able to do 15, 16 years ago, and I'm not letting that opportunity go. Because from the comfort of my home, I can keep the story going, I can tell the rest of it, I can make sure people do not forget Adnan, and that's really been my goal. And the mainstream media has come to me over and over and over. And I think what's amazing and remarkable is that, I mean, this is a state-level homicide case. You know, these things happen all across the country, the world, and recently Adnan was granted the right to appeal again, and when that happened, you know, it was a very simple ruling that happened in February. It was on the front page of BBC, you know. Irish radio called me, Irish National Radio called me and said, "Hi, we'd like to talk to you about the ruling." And it's crazy to me. So the point is that I feel hopeful in terms of advocacy for marginalized groups, and telling our stories and advocating for different causes and stuff, because I feel like social media gives us a path that we didn't have before, and also sort of storytelling. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to share. I guess that's it pretty much for me. If that's okay, and then I'll welcome your questions and we'll take the discussion from there.
All right, thank you. I'm Bruce Shapiro. I direct a project at Columbia Journalism School called the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, www.dartcenter.org, which trains journalists who cover trauma, everything from family violence and street crime up to war and international human rights. I too would like to thank the Yale MSA and the Shell Center and all the other co-sponsors for this important event, and I would like to welcome Rabia to the ranks of storytellers.
Thank you.
Quick poll. How many of you here listen to at least some of Serial? How many of you here listened to all of Serial? Be honest. Wow. How many of you here are law students?
Oh, interesting.
Okay, interesting. Okay.
You are not my future overlords then.
No. They still are.
They still are.
In different parts of the power spectrum.
You're right.
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to unpack a little bit of what Rabia talked about the relationship between advocates and journalists and storytelling. I'm going to do it partly from my own experience as a journalist, which is all I'm sort of really qualified to talk about. And in particular, in some ways, as someone who, after 9/11, when I was doing a lot of writing on civil liberties, became one of those people who became a kind of touch point for advocates seeking to get stories about rising discrimination against Muslim Americans in places like airports, trying to get attention to important civil liberties cases like the Samuel Al-Arian case in Florida, which I wrote about at great length. Cases that were often very complex and that often have not gotten much traction up to that point. So I have some experience with this, and I should say that, you know, Rabia was talking about the mainstream media, and this is a phrase we all throw around a lot. But I think one of the lessons of Serial and of your experience with Sarah Koenig is that there's the media as maybe publishing companies, but actually the media is made up of journalists. It's made up of individual journalists with individual agendas, individual capacities, individual interests, individual strengths and weaknesses. And as news professionals, whether it is for This American Life, which then spun off Serial, which I'd argue is actually fairly mainstream. NPR is kind of as mainstream as you get, just because they decided to do this one as a podcast, as an experiment, doesn't mean it's not mainstream. To, you know, Pacifica and Amy Goodman, or to The Nation, or to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the BBC. All of us as journalists are the sort of capillary system for the stories that our society tells itself. And if we're telling stories, they get heard. If we're not telling stories, they don't get heard. So we depend actually on advocates and activists to bring stories like Adnan's to us and to help us figure out what's news. I want to start by talking a little bit, though. Well, let me think about this. Serial is probably one of the great success stories of an advocate bringing a single obscure case to a journalist and it just goes viral. And I agree with you, I think it's because she treated it as a reporting procedural, she treated it as a mystery story. It wasn't on the surface about a Muslim community issue or rights and discrimination in the sort of obvious way. It had traction specifically because it's just a story about a guy and something bad that happened to a guy. And yet it raises all of these other issues about presumptions about society, about the public narrative, and how Muslim Americans are fitting into a broader American narrative. So it's a huge success story about the relationship between an advocate and a reporter, which turns into a relationship between a reporter and a central figure in a story, which turns into a story which turns into a worldwide phenomenon. I'm not surprised to hear that Irish Broadcasting was calling you up. They follow Australia, Ireland, Britain, all follow these kinds of developments in the United States very closely. It's not just an American issue. I'm going to talk about something that went wrong, because not with Serial, but with another story. Because for all of the power of the advocate-journalist relationship that Rabia put on display, it's also possible for the advocate-journalist relationship to go seriously off the rails. And for those of you who either in law school or in law school now or are thinking about becoming attorneys, those of you who are advocates working on community issues or civil rights issues, those of you who want to be journalists, anyone here thinking about being a journalist, by the way? Any? Yes? Okay, cool. Right? More of you should. Anyway, it's important to know not just why stories go right, but why they go wrong. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a case in which advocacy and journalism went wrong, some lessons from that, some lessons from times they've gone right, and then we'll go to a conversation. The case that I want to talk to you about, you probably have also heard of. It's the Rolling Stone University of Virginia sexual assault case, which has gotten an equal amount of obsessive national and international attention. You all will remember that in the fall, in late October, Rolling Stone published a story by a reporter named Sabrina Erdley about a sexual assault, gang rape, an alleged gang rape at the University of Virginia, involving a victim named, given the pseudonym of Jackie in the story, in which the administration of the university responded as university administration so often do in sexual offenses, appallingly. And it got all kinds of national attention until it started to unravel. And it turned out that Jackie, who was a real person, was describing events that at the very least hadn't happened in the way Rolling Stone and she had said they happened, and that Rolling Stone hadn't done its fact-checking, and the whole thing has turned into a different kind, now a media scandal. A huge embarrassment for a reporter who has done distinguished work before, and a huge embarrassment for Rolling Stone, which has a track record of important investigative reporting. In fact, two of my colleagues at Columbia Journalism School, where the Dart Center is based, my dean and the dean of academic affairs, authored a report last month at Rolling Stone's request, which was quite scathing about the failures of journalism. What I want to highlight here, for purposes of this discussion, is that the Rolling Stone story started as a relationship between an advocate and a journalist. Sabrina Erdley, the Rolling Stone reporter, was canvassing campuses, looking for interesting and previously unreported campus sexual assault cases that would illuminate where the issue is now. She met the director of the Rape Crisis Center at the University of Virginia, and there was this young woman, who we'll call Jackie because the story calls her Jackie, and we don't know her name beyond that, who had been coming to rape crisis groups for quite a while and had been repeating this story. And the advocate, as advocates do and should do, thought, oh, this is interesting, and made the connection, and said to Sabrina Erdley, I think, to the reporter, there's someone you would like to, who might be interesting to talk to, and said to this student, Jackie, there's a reporter interested in this issue. Are you interested in talking to her? And this, by the way, this is all from sort of already, this is not secret stuff. This is all in the Rolling Stone Columbia Report, it's in other news sources, there's no secret information. So the connection was made, and the Rolling Stone reporter interviewed the subject of the story at length and in depth. Jackie ended up balking at certain kinds of fact-checking requests, but her story was so detailed and consistent and told in the same way that the reporter and the fact-checkers at the magazine and the editors all decided it felt solid and went with it. And the consequence has been catastrophic all around. It has turned into what started out as an advocacy to journalists, to story subject, success story, just like Serial, draw its attention, has turned into something toxic for everybody connected to it. It's been profoundly damaging from everything we can tell to Jackie, about whom publicly some important questions about her credibility have been raised. She hasn't publicly commented since this report was released, but there have been news accounts of her refusing to talk, and friends who now say they don't trust her, and so on. It's been catastrophic for the career of this reporter and of her editor. Why hasn't anyone been fired? Jon Stewart is even saying, why hasn't anyone been fired at Rolling Stone? And it has been very damaging nationally for the cause of advocacy against campus sexual assault and advocacy for reform of these policies. You have two kind of conversations going on. Reporters saying, I'm not going to be able to do these stories anymore because my editors are going to be scared. And potential sources saying, I'm not going to talk to reporters because I'm going to be dragged through the mud and it's going to be really tough and I'm not up for this. So this was a case where the advocacy relationship and the journalism relationship went wrong. Let me talk about what went wrong by comparing that to what can go right. We saw what can go right in Syria, but let me put even in terms of sexual assault on college campuses, which is very much parallel to these kinds of stories of victimization of Muslims or any other community. There will be similar issues that arise. The irony of the Rolling Stone story is that actually there is now 15 years of superb reporting on campus sexual assault, which has changed the national conversation as profoundly as Serial has changed certain conversations, and in some ways even more so. You can go back to the early 2000s and when some of this reporting started. You can go back to 2009 when the Center for Public Integrity and a reporter named Kristen Lombardi did meticulous reporting on college campuses all over the country, including this one, including the University of Virginia, laying out the flaws of what happens when the students bring sexual assault complaints. And in fact, the White House task force that has since formed are all the result of this reporting over the last decade. And in all of those cases that are successful, reporters have developed powerful, trusting relationships with advocates. Those advocates have, in a very fair, transparent way, provided the opportunity for victims, survivors, or people to talk to reporters, have gotten out of the way while reporters then do their jobs. And the reporters who do this stuff well have empathized profoundly with their sources, have developed a strong hypothesis of what's wrong with the system and have pursued that in factual reporting and in storytelling, but also have kept enough distance to say to their sources, I'm going to need to check you out. We can't confirm what happened in that moment when something terrible is alleged to have happened between two people, because there are only two, there's a perpetrator and a victim, and no one can know beyond that. But I'm going to need to confirm as much corollary information as possible. Serial was actually a very interesting example of a reporter trying to circle an unknowable moment by corroborating, by developing as much corroborative material as possible from witnesses, other kids, teachers, videotapes, all that sort of stuff that got explored like an onion skin being peeled week after week was really about circling a moment of unknowable terror, unknowable injustice, by corroborating as much as possible. That's when reporting and storytelling work. And as advocates, you need to trust good reporters to do that process. I think that actually what went wrong in Rolling Stone, and what I've seen go wrong in other kinds of stories, sometimes though none that have risen to that level, is when either sometimes advocates themselves bring stories to reporters that aren't really, they bring sources who are not really ready, or they bring stories where there just isn't enough to be checked out. And they become angry when reporters don't want to look into these things, but good reporters end up kind of saying, well, let me meet the source, and it turns out the source is sketchy, or they start to look at corroborative detail and say, it's a great story, but I'm not going to be able to corroborate this. Or they may have a victim in the middle of it who says, you can't, this happened to me, but it's going to be too upsetting for me to have you go through court records, or to have you call my teachers, or to have you do whatever. And then as a reporter, you need to walk away in a non-judgmental way and say, then that means we can't do a story. That doesn't mean what happened to you didn't happen. It's no judgment on you. But if you're not ready to do this, my professional ethics require me to walk away. When stories go wrong, it's because somebody forgets that. When narratives go wrong, it's because somebody forgets that. When advocates become defensive, victims themselves become defensive, and can't listen to what the ethical obligation of the reporter is. And it's important to remember that what Sarah Koenig did so well, and what the great reporters on campus sexual assault have done so well, and what Sabrina Bergley and Olson unfortunately did not do so well, is keep the needs of the story at the center of the project. And the story, when you defend the needs of the story, the need for it to be factually accurate, for it to be credible, for it to be compelling narrative, all of that, you're actually defending the interests of the subject, and you're defending the underlying civil rights issue or whatever it is that you come to work on. And when, as a reporter, you simply take what a victim, survivor, inmate says and just repeat it, you're actually setting that person up for a beating, for being taken down, and you're setting the issue and other issue advocates up for a beating, to be taken down. If Sarah Koenig had not spent, how many weeks are there in serial?
12.
12. Had she not spent 12 one-hour episodes and an entire year kind of picking this thing apart, not only would the story probably not have gone as far, but it would have been easy for people to tear it down. And it's the very meticulousness of it that does the job. As advocates and as activists, and having come from that kind of a background myself into journalism, I remember this very well, we want to take people's side and get very angry when reporters want to do meticulous jobs. You need to let that happen. Okay? And I think that's something that Serial did quite admirably. And also remember that what works as journalism and what will advance your issue sometimes is, as Rabia said, simply storytelling that does not have politics on its sleeve, that is not overtly ideological, that reflects social commitments in its choice of subject and approach to the story, but is just great narrative that anybody can listen to. Let me leave you with one other idea in the conversation, which is about the relationship of narrative and justice and injustice. Those of you who are going to be lawyers, and those of you who are going into other civil rightsy kinds of professions, I'm sure think a lot about justice and what it means. And we get very angry when the legal system fails in delivering justice, and that's legal system fails. It's also true that the legal system delivers, when it does deliver, a very narrow kind of justice. A murder, the perpetrator of a murder or a sexual assault is justly convicted and sent to jail. That's only part. That's one kind of narrow legal justice. It actually doesn't necessarily do a whole lot for the victim or for surviving family. Genocide, right? Cambodia, Rwanda, take your pick. There's not, we can have international tribunals and send people to jail, and should, but there's only a limited, narrow kind of justice in that. War crimes, we can bring the case of Gaza to the International Criminal Court, or have an investigation of it. We can look at U.S. bombing of Iraq in the war crimes context and maybe get some attention. It's not going to, that's only one kind of justice. There's a whole other kind of justice which Serial also gets to, and has to do with the role of journalism and the relationship between journalism and advocacy. And that is narrative justice. That is to say, are the interests of people who have been victimized, are their stories being told, or are they invisible? Adnan was an invisible victim, right? Until this story came along. An invisible character in the case of miscarriage of justice, except to a tiny number of people who were his friends and allies. Whatever happens in the legal system in the short run, that is no longer the case. And actually, for the young woman at the middle, her story is now out there as well. And the woman who died is now out there in a very different way. So as journalists and as advocates who work with journalists, it's important to remember that you're not just framing stories for the legal arena. You are framing stories in ways that A, can be profoundly ratifying to individuals, to families, and entire communities that don't easily have the power to speak or be represented. And you also are changing the way society thinks about individual cases or sometimes entire historical events. That's a very powerful kind of justice, and I would argue that both journalists and advocates, journalists and activists, all of us, have that as a core mission, a core moral mission. And one of the lessons from Serial is a reminder of the power of the relationship between narrative and justice. There's the part that happens in the courtroom, and then there's the part that happens in society. Conversation, argument, theories, questions.
I'm going to start by giving you a round of applause. Does anybody want to moderate them? All right, we'll just take them.
Yeah.
Thanks. Interesting. There's a book. Adnan was invisible or voiceless until Serial or until your activism. But I'm wondering, like, you talked about narrative justice, so there's still like. There's a victim here who hasn't been heard, right?
Yep.
So in this case, if I remember correctly, because it's been a while, like the murder victim's parents didn't want to talk with Sarah Koenig, so they weren't involved. But I'm wondering what happens here when there's an alternative narrative that gets the same kind of treatment. How does that affect the?
Well, let me just set the record straight. Actually, that's not what happened. Sarah tried really, really hard to find Hay's family and was unable to do so. When Hay was murdered, she was living at the time with her grandparents, her mother, and her brother. Her parents were divorced. Her father was not really in her life. Some people have said he lived in California. Some people said it was a stepfather who lived in California. That's always been a little bit unclear. but Sarah tried everything she could. She could not find them. It wasn't that she contacted any member of the family and they said no. She actually couldn't locate them. What's happened after Serial, because a lot has happened after Serial, is one thing that's happened is there's a couple of attorneys who've been doing this investigation more into the case. I gave them access to all the documents. They've been blogging, and Hayes' brother has popped up online commenting here and there. He commented once on a Reddit thread, and then he commented once on this one professor, he's a law professor at Colin Miller, his blog. And he was commenting in response to an issue that Colin had raised about the condition of the car when the police had finally released it to the family. Like, what was really broken and what Jay said and all these things. And so her brother actually responded and said, I remember picking up the car with my grandfather and I was a new driver and I couldn't drive it because the turn signal was broken. So they're, you know, at least her brother is paying attention to this, you know, evolving and the story moving forward, and they know if he's reading an obscure blog by this evidence professor, I'm sure he knows what's happening in Adnan's case, right? So there's certainly an opportunity. I can imagine if they wanted to speak to media, if they wanted to tell their stories, every outlet will be interested in hearing it. But I think that Serial and subsequent investigations have planted some doubts in their minds too. And that's what I assume, because they're quietly watching.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, look, one of the challenges of being a good advocate on a case like this is you do need to let the narrative chips fall where they may. It's, I mean, a couple of reporters have talked to Jay, have talked to the prosecutor, and there are people who wouldn't talk to Sarah Koenig for one reason or another, and once the thing was out there, they realized, oh shit, I guess I'm going to talk to somebody. Pardon my French, but, and that's going to happen. It's one reason, actually, that if you are going to bring a story to journalists, you need to be pretty confident about the quality of this particular character's character and story. You need to be pretty confident, because a good reporter, including a good reporter who's very sympathetic, is going to have a professional obligation to pick away and make sure that it's credible. And you'll end up being dipped if the story turns out to fall apart. So, you know, again, I've seen this happen really well, and then once in a while I've seen it happen badly, where someone who was supposedly had something bad happen to them, turns out to be guilty of sin, or it turns out, you know, and you have to let reporters do their job, and part of, again, being a skillful advocate is figuring out which journalists you can trust, checking out their previous work, having a previous relationship in which you test them and they've come through. There's that side of it too, but there's a lot that happens in the world that's ambiguous. Also, we need to recognize as advocates that even when we present victims of injustice to journalists, sometimes victims are complicated people and they have things in their character that aren't so great. Years ago, did a story about a guy who had been wrongfully incarcerated in a Connecticut psychiatric hospital as a serial killer for 18 years. He had been coerced into confessing by a psychiatrist who was in league with the police. He had gotten a criminally insane ruling, had spent 18 years locked up, and really didn't do it. And in fact, there was an alternative perpetrator, all kinds of evidence that was covered up. Long story. But he was also not a very appealing character. He had beaten his own wife. He had a violent temper. He was a paranoid schizophrenic who didn't get along with people very well. And I was lucky. I was in that case working with an attorney who knew me, who was willing to trust me to deal with the complicated parts of this guy's personality, both in my own assessment of him and in my story. But you do need to know that a good journalist is going to deal with the complicated nature and has to contend with the complicated nature of the victims that society puts up to us. And very rarely do we get a pristine, perfect survivor, victim justice. Yeah.
My question is directed to you specifically about the sort of narrative of Serial, but also I'd like to hear your thoughts about this generally. But I'm interested in the process of surrendering control of the narrative and then trying to reclaim it. So now you let Sarah take over the storytelling, and now you're starting your own podcast to best present the theories that you think the evidence construes. And so I was wondering to hear about your process in doing that, and then also I guess the challenge of still, I guess the things that we talked about earlier about presenting this objective, really fact-checked story, and you read about it on your website about how it's not going to be a merely pro-Adnan slant and how you're going to try to show both sides. But then,
Are you on the new podcast?
But to some extent, I guess in the way that Sarah presented it, it's not the best side, and there's still information that you want to show to put forward, like maybe a certain agenda. And so I was just hoping that you could speak to that.
So at no point did I ever want to usurp the story from Sarah, but obviously even in 12 hours, she really couldn't get to every single detail. Not only could she not get to every single detail, the truth is, this is the honest truth, and it's no slight on Sarah, because the truth is, these details escaped me, they escaped lawyers over 15 years. When Susan Simpson, who's one of the attorneys who blogs, I started putting transcripts and other things on the website. Totally, I never met her before, I didn't know who she was. I started reading her blogs, and she started seeing things and, putting together pieces that nobody ever had. And so that started happening, I think, about halfway through Serial. So that was a very important addition to what Sarah was doing. Now, what Sarah did was, people want to listen to our really terribly amateurish podcast, but really geeky and like very detailed. And it's like, then the process, it's very it's very detailed, intense. We have a totally different slant on it. She told a story that is compelling to just the
Millions of people.
Right, general public.
Yeah.
This is where the people want to get into the really, 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 really weeds. And so I don't think we're necessarily doing. I feel like it's a whole different thing. I don't feel like we're messing with her story at all. And I don't think she does either. Yesterday we were texting. She's like, "How's it going?" I'm like, "Yeah, podcasting is really hard."
Thank you. Yes,
So I respect her. I will never ever be able to thank her for what she did, because there's nothing I could have done, no amount of blogging and podcasting on my own that would have accomplished what she was able to accomplish. And for me, it was all about the case, and that's what it comes down to.
I have a couple of really great questions. First of all, I do want to say, in defense of my tribe, and in particular because we do beat up on the mainstream media all the time, journalism is hard, and thank you for recognizing that the craft of getting a story from a pile of facts to something that people actually want to listen to is really a challenge, and all the more so when the subject is one that involves murder of a young woman, that involves great violence, that involves the ruination of a young man's life, when the subject is trauma of any kind. This is really hard reporting. And if Sarah had managed to track down Hayes' family, she would have had to sit there in the living room with the family of a murdered child, which is as tough a thing as you can do as a reporter. And you need to know that too. I hope you listen or read reporting with a new kind of respect for the craft that goes into it, even if you find yourself frustrated. But I do want to talk about this idea of control of the story. This is really important. There's actually sort of two levels. Yes, you lost control of the story to a reporter. You had to willingly kind of hand over the file and say, go do your thing. But Adnan also gives up control of the story. And, when people, whether it's people who are in prison or people who have had real violence in their lives, they've lost power like that and lost control over existence and over their own safety. Part of trauma is often a sense that you've lost control of everything except the story. So when we, whether as advocates or journalists, come into the room and go to bat for someone who's wrongfully incarcerated or has been discriminated against or has been sexually assaulted in a Peace Corps or whatever it is. There's a high emotional valence, a kind of hidden tripwire that is about betrayal on the ground of storytelling. Oh my God, you are taking control of my story. And you're not gonna get it right, and you can't understand it, nobody else can understand it's mine. That's something you need to be prepared to encounter, and often as storytellers, we are the vehicles for exceptional anger from the people we're trying to help because they feel we've somehow gotten the story wrong or taken it away from them. And that's a very common experience and something you really need to think about, partly just by kind of transparency with the subjects of stories and advocacy campaigns about what it's going to mean, what it's going to be like. Okay. But it can happen. And it's also why getting the facts right is so important. Because sometimes I've seen cases where you get one seemingly secondary fact, well, really, actually secondary, but the person feels so violated by the experience of injustice that's at the core of the story that anything gets seized on and a great rage comes out. Reporters or advocates can become the vehicles for a sense of betrayal that's really profound. So that's, something to think
Can I just say, I won't say who, but Sarah experienced that in this case. There were a couple of people who she interviewed, she then got the brunt of their anger and rage. Adnan was not one of them. They still chat, but yeah. So she, having no experience in journalism, I realized like how complicated that relationship is, and how touch and go it can even be. Yeah.
But so as is being an attorney or an issues advocate, you give your all within the system to somebody, and the system doesn't deliver, or doesn't deliver in the way in which they hope, even if you were completely transparent about what's possible, and blam, it's profound.
So, first of all, thank you for coming. As you mentioned, there's a lot that's come out from the podcast there, and